Good morning, Mr. Prime Minister. Could you give us a few words? How are you feeling? What's your attitude? This is not about attitudes, it's serious matters. What are your expectations? Donald Tusk gives testimony as his friend and subordinate Tomasz Arabski faces trial. Do the parties insist on taking the oath from the witness? Yes, Your Honour. All rise. I solemnly swear to tell the whole truth, not hiding anything from what is known to me. He repeatedly stressed that he was neither responsible for organising foreign visits nor supervising preparations. From my point of view, it was important for Minister Arabski to establish with his counterparts, with relevant people, the agenda for the Smolensk talks. The then head of the Polish government was questioned about the established agenda and the secret meeting between Arabski and Yuri Ushakov, deputy head of Vladimir Putin's administration at Moscow's Dorian Gray restaurant. What did they discuss? According to Donald Tusk, the history of the Katyn massacre. Historical and educational matters of sorts. He also referred to the issue of the so-called separation of visits of the President and the Prime Minister. Separation of visits was a journalistic or political term coined mostly in order to discredit myself and my office. However, contrary to what Donald Tusk testified under oath in this courtroom, the visits by the Polish Prime Minister and the Polish President to Russia for the 70th anniversary of the Katyn massacre have actually been separated. This came about as a result of months-long talks between Polish and Russian governments. Talks that were being concealed from the chancellery of the President. As a result, Vladimir Putin, Prime Minister of the Russian Federation, invited the Polish Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, to Russia 3 days ahead of the date when President Lech Kaczynski was scheduled to travel to Russia.
Albo jesteś naszym wrogiem, albo naszym kompanem.
Over decades of cynical lies, they've been trying to conceal the truth about the Katyn executions. But it would be just as much of a lie to place the blame for these on the Russian people. Mr. Prime Minister, they are here after all, buried at this very place. And they are watching, through the empty eye sockets and their shot-through skulls, watching and waiting to see if we are capable of turning violence and lies into reconciliation.
Dokładnie
17 days after Vladimir Putin's speech at Westerplatte, where the politician attempted to build a new European architecture on a historical lie, Lech Kaczynski, president of Poland, tore the "From Lisbon to Vladivostok" concept to shreds, speaking right here at the monument to the murdered in the East, on the 70th anniversary of Russian aggression against Poland.
Pomordowanym na wschodzie w 70. rocznicę rosyjskiej agresji na Polskę.
70 lat temu.
70 years ago today, exactly 70 years ago, Poland was stabbed in the back. The Polish army was still fighting. It was fighting in Warsaw, Modlin, Hell, the Lwów region, the Lublin region, and many other places in our country. The Battle of Kutno was still unresolved. And on that very day, at around 2 a.m., a Soviet army of 600,000 plus invaded Poland. They committed an aggression. Our army resisted the Soviet aggressor in multiple locations.
Sowieckiemu agresorowi. Żołnierze są od tego, żeby ojczyzny bronić.
It's a soldier's job to defend the country, and many of them, officers in particular, were taken prisoner.
Decyzją z 5 marca 1940 roku.
Then, by virtue of decision from March the 5th, 1940, formally taken by the Politburo, but actually by Stalin, they were murdered.
Zostali wymordowani.
If this kind of an act pertaining to 30,000 people is not an act of genocide, then let me ask, what is?
Ludobójstwa, to się pytam, co nim jest. Pytam się, bo to pytanie.
And I'm asking because we've heard this question in Poland already, and not from just anyone.
Tę kwestię
Vladimir Putin, Prime Minister of the Russian Federation, asked this very question in Poland just moments earlier, claiming that Katyn was merely one of many Stalinist crimes. In 1939 to 1941, on an area that covered more than 50% of the territory of the pre-war Poland, the Second Polish Republic,
To lata nie tylko mordów na oficerach. To także
these are years not only of murders of officers, but also thousands of executions, murders of political activists, including, interestingly, left-wing activists, who at first thought, here come the good times. But they were over sooner than they have actually begun. They were overdue to Soviet firing squads. Years of destruction of the Polish intelligentsia with not thousands but hundreds of thousands of people deported. Years of labor camps and death. Murders of men, women and children. This is the truth about those times. And it is in our interest, political interest as well, to remember that. Even more so when, on September the 1st, the 70th anniversary of World War II at Westerplatte, at a symbolic site,
w miejscu, które jest symbolem, słyszymy o planie nowej architektury Europy.
we hear about plans for a new European architecture. Poland's position within such new architecture seems extremely constrained. Quite naturally, one may say, we must not try to fit in there.
Szukajmy Europy partnerskiej, w której
Let us seek a cooperative Europe, one where Poland's position befits its greatness and history.
wynikające z jego wielkości i historii. Od historii
For it is impossible to escape history.
Po wyjeździe Władimira Putina
Following Vladimir Putin's departure from Poland, a new term emerges throughout diplomatic documents describing relations between the Russian Federation and Poland, the Sopot format. It refers to agreements made between Putin and Tusk concerning three areas: economy, politics and history. The economic issues focus primarily, from the Russian perspective, on gas supplies under contract running through 2037, currently being negotiated. The political issues constitute the concept of a new European architecture, from Vladivostok to Lisbon, even if only for geographical reasons it had to gain some sort of approval from Poland. But actually, it's the historical issues that were, at the end of the day, the key to this fundamental concept. Namely, Russia's responsibility for the crimes it has committed has kept preventing it from playing the role Vladimir Putin has contrived, that of scaffolding supporting the new European architecture. We can find evidence for how crucial Katyn was to this policy in these unknown and never-before-published documents. Even before Vladimir Putin's visit to Poland in September, letters were exchanged between Radosław Sikorski and Sergei Lavrov. These letters clearly indicated that Tusk and Putin wanted to erase the issue of Katyn and responsibility for the crime from the list of contentious issues. This was being handled by Adam Daniel Rothfeld, a communist security confidant operating back then under Ralph and Serb call signs. In the reset era, he served as a co-chairman of the Polish-Russian group on difficult matters, and was Donald Tusk's closest associate working on Russia-related issues. It was the efforts of this group that politicians used as a tool to bargain the Katyn issue. This is an excerpt from a letter Sikorski sent to Lavrov in the summer of 2009. Dear Minister, dear Sergei, I have studied the letter by the chairman of the group on difficult matters concerning the issue of Katyn. It was addressed to us as well as the Prime Ministers of Poland and Russia, Donald Tusk and Vladimir Putin. As you may remember, this letter follows a request Prime Minister Tusk and Prime Minister Putin made to the chairman to prepare specific proposals that would help resolve the issue to mutual satisfaction. In the letter, Sikorski also suggested that the Katyn issue should be the subject of Putin and Tusk's first September talks in Westerplatte. This has finally come to be. The response which Lavrov sent to the Foreign Ministry 2 weeks prior to Putin's arrival in Poland reads, Dear Minister, dear Radosław, I agree that the meeting of the group on difficult matters proved useful from the point of view of exchanging views on the removal of Katyn from our bilateral relations agenda. President Lech Kaczynski remained an obstacle, though. One must be able to admit one's sins after all, rather than claim a decision to murder 30,000 people to be equal to a typhus epidemic or another malady of that kind. This is not the path to reconciliation.
Po wyjeździe Putina, rządzący Polską politycy Platformy
After Putin's departure, Poland's ruling Civic Platform and Polish People's Party politicians were aware that the issue has not been settled to the Russian satisfaction yet. In late September, a draft resolution on Katyn emerged in the same, a bizarre resolution. The Soviets admitted that they had committed the Katyn massacre themselves. From that moment on, though, simultaneously to the admission, first the Soviets and then the Soviets disguised as Russians, as the Russian Federation, have been striving to prevent the Katyn massacre from being recognized as a crime of genocide until this very day. Had that happened, Russia, as the legal heir to the Soviet Union, would have to account for the Katyn massacre in full.
Całkowicie. Od przekazania wszystkich materiałów archiwalnych poprzez zadośćuczynienie względem państwa.
Handing over all the archives, to reparations to the state whose citizens were murdered back in 1940 as part of the Katyn operation, to individual reparations concerning the Katyn victims' family members.
Przedstawicieli rodzin katyńskich. I to jest jakby podstawowa.
And this is the basic issue that Donald Tusk faced consciously.
Donald Tusk stanął w moim przekonaniu świadomie.
On September the 23rd, 2009, the Polish Sejm, with the Civic Platform and the Polish People's Party majority, announced to the whole world that Katyn had been nothing more than a war crime. For the first time in the history of the Polish parliamentarianism.
Ludowego, po raz pierwszy w historii polskiego parlamentaryzmu, to trzeba podkreślić, ogłasza całemu światu, że Katyn był jedynie zbrodnią wojenną. Wbrew
This was contrary to the entire legal position, various expert reports, books, and the investigation, which at that time was already being conducted by the Institute of National Remembrance. Against all that, the political majority led by Donald Tusk and Władimir Pawlak resolved that the Katyn massacre had been just a war crime.
Zbrodnia katyńska była jedynie, w cudzysłowie to mówię, zbrodnią wojenną.
The list of crimes and misfortunes that afflicted the eastern regions of the Second Polish Republic and the Polish citizens who found themselves there at the time is an extensive one. It includes the war crime of execution by the NKVD of more than 20,000 defenseless prisoners of war, Polish officers. The Gulag Archipelago claimed millions of lives from all peoples of the region, including many USSR citizens. How this system had been organized in the first place, how long it existed for, and on what scale it operated, all mean these crimes, including the Katyn massacre, bear all the distinctive characteristics of a genocide. A crime with the characteristics of a genocide. How should we understand this paragraph that contains this phrase? Firstly, one must remember that the September 2009 parliamentary resolution had received desperate attempts at rectification from the Law and Justice Parliamentary Club. That is, the club demanded an unambiguous qualification of Katyn as a genocide, just as it's always been the case. And then Speaker Komorowski agreed to a certain compromise, that is, not exactly where Katyn is mentioned in the text, because that qualification was obvious. A war crime was being discussed there, but where various kinds of Soviet crimes and wrongdoing has been referred to in plural without any specific details. The phrase, including the crime of Katyn, was to be added. Characteristics of a genocide. These characteristics of a genocide simply refer to a whole sentence that read as follows. How this system had been organized in the first place, how long it existed for, and on what scale it operated, all mean these crimes, including the Katyn massacre, bear all the distinctive characteristics of a genocide. Katyn, among others, and not as a genocide, but as something bearing the characteristics of a genocide. The key sentence, on the other hand, is in the earlier paragraph that defines what is at stake more explicitly. It refers to various Soviet crimes and runs more or less like this. It includes the war crime of execution by the NKVD of more than 20,000 defenseless prisoners of war, Polish officers. It is an unambiguous definition of the Katyn massacre, for the reason that there was no other operation of this nature, of this magnitude at that time, that could be called a war crime, plain and simple, other than Katyn. That's a fact. What is the difference between a war crime and a genocide? And why are these categories not interchangeable?
Na temat ścigania zbrodni ludobójstwa z 1948 roku mówi o tym,
The International Convention on the Prosecution of the Crime of Genocide of 1948 states that genocide is an act that harms either all or part of an ethnic group in such a way.
Albo w część grupy etnicznej,
In some sense, it prevents that ethnic group, in this case the Poles, from its natural development. It damages, so to speak, that national group, that community, in such a permanent way that is unable to, as it were, develop further.
Uszkadza, że tak powiem, tą grupę narodową, tą wspólnotę w na tyle trwały sposób, że ona nie jest w stanie jakby dalej się rozwijać. Bez tej elity narodu naród polski...
Without this elite of the nation, even if the war had ended in 1940 and all the subsequent German, Soviet and Ukrainian crimes had not occurred, the Polish nation, following this defect related to the implementation of the Katyn operation, could simply not develop naturally in that sense.
Po prostu nie mógłby się w naturalny sposób rozwijać.
And the entire legal effort aiming at naming Katyn as a crime of genocide follows this train of thought, so to speak.
Podąża, że tak powiem, tą myślą.
Co to znaczy uniwersalizacja?
What does the
Katynia?
universalization of Katyn mean in the context of the reset?
Dla Donalda Tuska Katyń miał być ostateczną legitymizacją resetu.
For Donald Tusk, Katyn was to be the ultimate legitimization of the reset. Katyn was to lend credibility to Donald Tusk's entire pro-Russian policy from 2007 until its very end. And the universalization of Katyn lies in the revitalization of this crime, both in the legal sense and in the sense of reducing this crime to a link in a very long chain of crimes that the Soviets had committed.
Bardzo długiego łańcucha zbrodni, które Sowieci popełnili. I właśnie teraz się włącza.
And now the Russian perspective comes into play, first focusing on Soviet citizens, only afterward on citizens of other countries. This establishes a group, a chain of great Stalinist crimes, not even Soviet ones, whereby the Poles of Katyn are just a teeny tiny part. A chain of crimes that Joseph Stalin and his comrades committed.
Po prostu właśnie tego łańcucha zbrodni, których dokonał Józef Stalin i jego ekipa. Taki Katyń jest...
That kind of Katyn is a Katyn, one might say, acceptable to Vladimir Putin's Russian Federation. Katyn, which is not exceptional at all. But why is it exceptional, objectively speaking?
Katynia nawet nie polega na tym, że każda z tych skrytek
This objective uniqueness of Katyn does not even stem from the fact that each of these caches, of these boxes, holds an item that used to belong to a particular Polish citizen, a soldier who was murdered in Katyn. It stems from the fact that the best of the Polish army officers have been murdered there, at least out of those who found themselves in the eastern, at the frontiers of Poland, who simply found themselves in the paws of the Bolsheviks after September the 17th, 1939. It was a corps of officers selected using special services methods, all of them known by their names, military rank, knowledge, experience, merit for Poland, all of these meaning damning factors to the Soviets.
Doświadczeń, zasług dla Polski, czyli win.
And they were murdered, individually too. Not gassed, not killed in mass shootings, but individually, each going one by one.
Masowego rozstrzeliwania, tylko indywidualnie, każdy, jeden po drugim. Ten, który jest...
The one being murdered, seeing his colleagues who walked the path just before him and are now lying at the bottom of this pit.
Już leżą w tym dole.
Each of them was murdered individually.
Każdy z nich został zamordowany. Ale oni w swojej...
But together, they made up the officer corps of the Polish army. Just like the policemen murdered by the Soviets, the prosecutors, the settlers, the military, the reservists.
Osadnicy wojskowi, rezerwiści, oni wszyscy tworzą...
They all made up the elites of the Polish nation that found itself in Soviet hands after September the 17th, 1939. And, in that sense, this crime has no precedent.
Nie ma żadnego precedensu.
Sposób rozumienia
The understanding of the Katyn massacre was the subject of discussions that took place between Russian and Polish diplomats, between the Vladimir Putin and Donald Tusk governments, throughout the fall and winter and early spring of 2009-10.
zimy i wczesnej wiosny roku 2009 i 2010.
Russian diplomats were concerned that the Polish president, Lech Kaczynski, in line with what he had said repeatedly, would consistently call that crime a genocide. That he will say on the 70th anniversary of the Katyn massacre too. The Russians feared that a Russian president or Russian prime minister would have to listen to that, which would ruin the Russian Federation's geopolitical plans.
Federacji Rosyjskiej.
8 grudnia
On December the 8th, 2009, Mariusz Handel, a presidential minister, met with Russian ambassador to Poland, Vladimir Glinin, and informed him that President Kaczynski intended to go to Katyn for the commemoration of that 70th anniversary. The memo Handel drafts after the meeting reads,
czytamy.
Commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the murder of Polish officers in Katyn. The ambassador also expressed his interest in the preparations for the anniversary and the participation of the Polish president. He noted that the Russian side has not yet decided as to the participation of a representative of the Russian Federation authorities. I stated, although President Kaczynski had already been to Katyn once in 2007, it was quite possible that he would go there again. I pointed out the importance of this anniversary to many Polish families and the need to address them appropriately. At the same time, the memo's conclusions include an unequivocal statement that, in the opinion of the presidential minister, Poland should avoid the situation where Russia might rig the attendance of Polish authorities in the upcoming anniversary events. Auschwitz, Katyn, the commemoration of the end of World War II. The rank of representatives and the specific plans for the commemorations should be established ahead of time. This document is also sent to Tomasz Arabski, head of the Prime Minister's office. Thus, it is at this point Prime Minister Tusk and his closest associates also learn about the President's plans, specific steps taken already to implement these on behalf of the President's office. As the year draws to a close, the underlying idea of the Polish and Russian governments having shared plans is confirmed in one of Vladimir Putin's few personal letters to Donald Tusk. These are quite peculiar New Year's greetings.
Życzenia.
I highly appreciate the results of our September meeting in Gdansk as part of the 70th anniversary of the outbreak of World War II commemoration. I am ready to get involved in joint activities with you regarding the development of Russian-Polish relations and the implementation of joint projects in the economic, scientific, technical, humanitarian and other fields. This matches the interests of the peoples of our countries to a certain extent, as well as promotes the strengthening of stability and good neighbourhood values on the European continent. My best regards, Vladimir Putin. On January the 11th, at the headquarters of the Council for the Protection of Struggle and Martyrdom sites, organising the commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the Katyn massacre, the date considered at the time for the event is April the 10th, 2010. The following participants are invited to the organisational meeting. Bronisław Komorowski, Speaker of the Sejm of the Republic of Poland. Bogdan Borusewicz, Speaker of the Senate of the Republic of Poland. Bogdan Klich, Minister of Defence. Jerzy Miller, Minister of the Internal Affairs and Administration. Radosław Sikorski, Minister of Foreign Affairs. Tomasz Arabski, Head of the Prime Minister's Office. Krzysztof Kwiatkowski, Minister of Justice. General Marian Janicki, Head of the Government Protection Bureau. The President of the Republic has not been invited. A week later, on January the 18th, the head of the Prime Minister Tusk's office, Tomasz Arabski, confirmed April the 10th to be the Katyn visit date Prime Minister Donald Tusk had agreed to. Information about Donald Tusk's planned flight to Katyn quickly gets to the Russians. The news is relayed by the director of the Foreign Ministry's Eastern Department, Jarosław Radkiewicz, in his meeting with Russia's Deputy Ambassador to Poland, Dmitry Polyansky. I confirm that the commemorative event in Katyn on April the 10th this year will be held with the attendance of Prime Minister Donald Tusk, who considered it his moral duty to participate. I stress that the Polish side treats the said event as the main part of commemorating the 70th anniversary of the Katyn massacre abroad.
W ślad za rozmowami urzędników
Talks by high-level officials are followed, as usual, by talks at the political level. Deputy heads of the Polish and Russian foreign ministries meet in Moscow. On January the 25th, Deputy Foreign Minister Handel Katyniem travels to the Russian capital. The main task before him is to finalize the details of the meetings between Prime Minister Tusk and Prime Minister Putin, scheduled for April the 10th, 2010. This is clear from the documents that Minister Kramer flew to Moscow.
Moskwy poleciał minister Kremer.
Prime Minister Donald Tusk confirms his openness to a meeting. Option 1, meeting in Katyn on April the 10th. A meeting between the two Prime Ministers in Katyn would demonstrate that both the Polish and Russian sides are ready to symbolically end the Katyn issue by bearing witness to the truth in a spirit of reconciliation and forgiveness.
W notatce podsumowującej te...
The memo summarising the visit repeats the April 10th date several times. The deputy head of the Polish Foreign Ministry informed Yuri Ushakov, deputy head of the Prime Minister Putin's Office for International Affairs, that Donald Tusk was going to Katyn on April the 10th. I reported that Prime Minister Donald Tusk had decided to lead the Polish delegation at the main commemorative event in the Katyn forest on April the 10th this year. In accordance with the Russian proposal, the Polish delegation shall be accompanied by a special session of the group for difficult matters to be held in Smolensk. The meeting with Ushakov does not provide the Polish diplomat with enough information regarding the Russian attitude to Prime Minister Tusk's visit. He asked for more details during his next meeting with Minister Titov. He then demands specific proposals from Russia as to the Putin-Tusk talks. In response, the other party opined the Tusk-Putin meeting should be a summary of a certain stage in the development of bilateral relations, just like on September the 1st, 2009. If the parties consider that the commitments made in Sopot are being implemented as expected, this constitutes a rationale behind another meeting by Prime Ministers of the Republic of Poland and the Russian Federation. The Polish diplomat also added that the Polish side has decided to hold one official commemoration in Katyn to take place on April the 10th this year with the participation of Prime Minister Donald Tusk. I stressed that to us the commemoration in question was the main part of the events held abroad. I have not ruled out, though, that other delegations and groups from Poland will also arrive in Russia, Katyn and Mednoja, this year to honour the memory of the victims.
Stronie rosyjskiej jednoznacznie brzmiące...
Kramer gave a clear message to the Russians. It is accentuated very clearly in the MFA memos. And the message was that Donald Tusk decided to head the Polish delegation to the main Katyn commemoration in Katyn in April 2010.
I co bardzo ważne, na główne obchody katyńskie w Katyniu.
It's a very important message because it basically communicates that there is one official representative of Poland at the main national Katyn commemoration in Russia in April 2010, and that this representative is Prime Minister Donald Tusk.
W głównych obchodach, narodowych obchodach katyńskich w Rosji w kwietniu.
That is, any subsequent visit, even one with presidential rank, will no longer constitute the official representation, and it will certainly not be a visit to the main commemoration organized by the Polish authorities.
Prezydencką nie będzie już reprezentacją oficjalną, a na pewno nie będzie wyjazdem na uroczystość główną, którą organizują polskie władze.
Zapis rozmów.
The transcript of the discussions in Moscow clearly indicates that the Polish diplomats tried to convince the Russians that a reunion between Donald Tusk and Vladimir Putin should take place in Katyn. The Russians didn't oppose as such, but they had two conditions. Firstly, Lech Kaczynski was not to attend. They made this clear earlier. But secondly, they expected Poland to adopt a vision of Katyn that was in line with the Russian historical vision, that Katyn had not been a Russian genocide against Poles, but simply one of the many Stalinist crimes whose victims were members of various ethnic groups within the USSR. And since Katyn had not been a genocide, the Polish state has no grounds to make compensation claims.
To państwo polskie nie ma żadnych podstaw do tego, żeby zgłaszać roszczenia odszkodowawcze.
I strongly emphasize that the Polish side, including the Katyn families, does not expect monetary compensation from Russia. Instead, it would count on moral, historical reparations, expressed in particular through access to archives pertaining to the Katyn massacre and the cultivations of the victims' memory. That is mind-blowing, because reparations, in the form of compensation, plus the issue of disclosure and release of all materials, is part of the procedure described in law, which applies to both criminals classified as war crimes and crimes classified as genocide. And here, a general reference is being made to the Katyn families, of which I need to mention it here now. 7 families have filed, regardless of these governmental declarations, their complaints to the European Court of Human Rights. Here, a representative of the Polish government declares authoritatively what the Polish position is, as in, Poland does not want anything from you, basically, other than these moral, historical things. That is, what do moral, historical things even mean? Moral, that is, another representative of the Russian Federation uttering generalization about how the Katyn massacre was a Stalinist crime, and, in a historical sense, well, he will probably share some materials, but whether that is going to be all of them is a matter of goodwill.
At
the same time that talks are underway in Moscow between the Russian and Polish foreign ministries, in Warsaw, the President's Chancellery notifies the Russian embassy that the President will be in Katyn on April the 10th. The President's Chancellery sent a letter to Ambassador Grinin, and on February the 2nd, during a reception for the diplomatic corps at the Presidential Palace, Minister Handel personally informed Ambassador Grinin as well. On the same day, February the 2nd, Andrzej Przewoźnik, the organizer of this entire commemorative event, informs the participants of an official meeting, also getting ready for the event, that he has received an official confirmation from both the President and the Prime Minister, stating that both the President and the Prime Minister intended to visit in Katyn on April the 10th, 2010. A day later, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk receives a call from the Russian Federation Prime Minister Vladimir Putin. We are the first to publish the memo describing that call.
Publikujemy po raz pierwszy.
Prime Minister Vladimir Putin started with the New Year's greetings. He reported that agreements on Russian gas supplies to Poland until 2037 were to be finalized soon. He pledged quick completion of the work in that regard. Commenting on the upcoming anniversary of the Katyn massacre, he underlined his understanding of its significance to Polish people. He recalled talks held in Gdansk. He stated that Russians, victim of purges prior to World War II, as well as Red Army soldiers killed by the Germans and in 1943 were also buried in the Katyn forest. Vladimir Putin invited the Prime Minister of the Republic of Poland personally and officially to attend the commemoration together and honour the fallen. It seems to me that our joint participation will have a very important symbolic dimension. He added that, in his opinion, the commemoration should take a moral and ethical character. Putin's conversation with Tusk comes at a time when it is already obvious to the Russians it's not going to be possible to dissuade President Kaczynski from visiting Russia. They know Prime Minister Tusk is to be in Russia at the time too. So there's a threat of the Westerplatte scenario repeating, preventing the implementation of the plan Russians have had for long regarding Katyn.
Który strona rosyjska względem Katynia miała już od dawna. Dlatego właśnie w czasie tej
That's why a new idea came up during this conversation of a commemoration not organized by the Polish government, but rather by the Russian one.
rosyjski. Tym samym
Thus, the Polish Prime Minister went from being the host of a commemoration event held at the Cemetery of Polish Victims in Katyn, Russia, to being a guest at a commemoration held by the Russians to honor the victims of all the crimes committed in the early 1940s in Russia buried in Katyn.
popełnionych na początku lat 40. w Rosji, pochowanych w Katyniu. Premier Tusk
Prime Minister Tusk accepted both this proposal and this way of understanding Katyn without any hesitation. This can be seen in official statements made back then.
Z inicjatywy pana premiera Władimira Putina odbyła się...
On the initiative of Prime Minister Vladimir Putin, a telephone conversation was held between Prime Minister Putin and Prime Minister Donald Tusk.
Głównym celem tej rozmowy było
The
zaproszenie
objective of this call was for Prime Minister Putin to invite Prime Minister Donald Tusk to jointly commemorate the anniversary of the Katyn massacre.
wspólnego uczczenia rocznicy tragedii katyńskiej. Pan
Prime Minister Putin emphasized, I wanted to quote this to you verbatim, addressing the Prime Minister. I believe that our joint participation in this event would have a very important symbolic dimension. Prime Minister Tusk accepted the invitation. He expressed satisfaction that these arrangements made by both Prime Ministers during Prime Minister Putin's visit to Poland are materializing in this way regarding this painful date and the tragedy it's referring to.
Putina w Polsce, że te ustalenia materializują się właśnie w taki sposób.
Oczekując moralnego zadośćuczynienia,
While expecting moral remedy, we want to build better Polish-Russian relations at the same time too. A very difficult task indeed. It seems to me, though, that we have taken another step. But in Poland, we still have a sense of incomplete satisfaction for some time, I think. What will we expect from our neighbours? And I'm certain we'll soon be able to refer to them as friends. We would appreciate stronger, brighter, bolder declarations. But my colleagues, including Polish diplomats, explain our point of view is quite distant from the traditional Russian point of view. What seems to like a big step to the Russian side will always seem to us to be mid-length at best, or too small. But these steps need to be taken.
czy zbyt mały. Ale te kroki trzeba stawiać.
The technical details were agreed during a phone call one day later. Tomasz Arabski spoke with Yuri Oshukov, deputy head of Vladimir Putin's administration. During that call, the date of the Putin-Tusk meeting and Russia-organized commemoration was set. The Russian side had not agreed to the April the 10th date previously defined in Poland.
Rosjanie nie zgodzili się na ustaloną wcześniej w Polsce datę 10 kwietnia.
The conversation on February the 4th this year, at the request of the Russian side and in reference to the Prime Minister's February the 3rd conversation, Ushakov proposed setting a date for a meeting in Katyn. The Russian side's proposal is April the 6th. In his response, Arabski observed it was the date of the Council of the Ministers' session, so the date may be hard to get approval. He said that the Polish side was considering April the 10th for Saturday. After establishing mutual preferences as to the April the 9th or 11th dates, and in the absence of acceptance of April the 10th, Ushakov suggested April the 7th, a Wednesday.
Jako Data właśnie tych
April the 7th, as the date of Polish-Russian commemoration of the Katyn massacre, is first mentioned in a conversation between a very important advisor, as the documents put it, ahead of Prime Minister Vladimir Putin's administration, Ushakov, and the head of Prime Minister Donald Tusk's chancellery, Tomasz Arabski. In a telephone conversation between the two, Ushakov and Arabski, Ushakov, speaking on behalf of Russia, proposes April the 7th as the date of the commemoration to be attended by Tusk and Putin. Only in this context can Putin's phone call be fully understood.
Tuska i Putina. I dopiero w tym kontekście telefon Putina może być w pełni zrozumiały.
To w tym momencie
This is the moment when that materialized, when these visits were separated and the decision was finalized.
Tak, to jest moment, kiedy zostało to przypieczętowane.
Yes, this is the moment when it was finalized. From that moment, it was understood that on April the 7th, both Tusk and Vladimir Putin were going to visit Katyn. President Lech Kaczynski and his agenda, on the other hand, had been abandoned completely by that point in time.
Ostatecznie została osierocona.
Many years later, Tomasz Arabski, eventually convicted in the Smolensk trial, testified before the court that the separation of visits never took place. He did so in the form of a statement he made to the court, stating he would not answer any questions. A joint trip to Katyn had never been organised, so consequently the so-called separation of visits never took place. This term is popular in politicised aggressive journalism, but has no real equivalent.
Publicystyce politycznej, agresywnej bardzo często, ale nie ma go potwierdzenia w rzeczywistości.
Sometime later, Donald Tusk spoke similarly at the very same location. Did you have your own idea for this visit? It was an important anniversary after all, as you were kind enough to say. And given that every Polish person has an opinion on the subject, acting as Prime Minister and also being a Polish citizen, did you have any ideas of your own on the matter?
Biorąc pod uwagę ilość uroczystości w różnych miejscach.
It seemed quite obvious, given the number of events held in various locations, that there would be an appropriate occasion to mark the anniversary of Katyn, whether in Katyn, Kharkov or Warsaw.
Nie odrzucałem możliwości uczestniczenia.
I was not rejecting the option to attend the commemoration in Katyn either. I was waiting for more specific information from the organisers who initiated the event as to how and when such a commemoration would be held, when it would be held, and what the potential scenario would look like.
Ewentualny scenariusz takich uroczystości.
I think that sometime in mid-January I gave my staff the green light to officials, saying or assuming that it was possible, likely, for me to visit Katyn. At the beginning of February, this additional circumstance emerged, namely a possible joining commemoration of the Katyn massacre anniversary together with the Russian side. That sort of settled the nature and date of my visit.
Rozstrzygnęło o charakterze mojej wizyty i dacie.
Separation of visits was a journalistic or political term coined mostly in order to discredit myself and my office.
Konkretnie mnie i mojego urzędu.
Tomasz Arabski elaborated on this line of thinking in a conversation with reporters. He did not answer a key question journalists Ewa Stankiewicz and Marek Pisa asked him after he left the courtroom, though.
Kiedy Tomasz Arabski opuścił już salę sądową.
The fact that Minister Przewoźnik expected that perhaps the Prime Minister and/or the President would attend this commemoration does not mean that we organised anything together. That's all I was talking about in the courtroom. Let me go deeper on that point. In order to avoid that joint visit by the President and the Prime Minister, why has it never come to be? For what reason? This was one of the options. Why was it abandoned? Let me tell you something. No one has abandoned anything. I really like to ask you, this is too serious a matter to make politics and propaganda out of it. Don't make an issue out of it. You're not answering our questions. In the second half of February, Russian Ambassador Vladimir Grinin joins the game played against the president quite overtly. So far, we have not received any official questions, and therefore I can't say anything. So far, I haven't heard anything. Prime Minister Vladimir Putin has invited his colleague, Prime Minister Donald Tusk. Ambassador Grinin should not have misled the Polish public, as the letter from the President's office was sent on January the 27th. It's unfortunate that someone is attempting to spoil this commemoration, acting from the sidelines. This is a Polish occasion. We notified the Russian side that the President would be attending. If we could please curb the bitter controversy surrounding the issue of commemorating the victims of the Katyn massacre on its 70th anniversary. Who are you asking this from? Everyone. Another manifestation, not so much of impertinence, but of a very conscious and cynical act by the Russian diplomacy aimed at creating tensions in our mutual relations. Please ask the Presidential Palace. They sent the letter to Ambassador Grinin directly. As a result of this media game, the Polish President's office asked Ambassador Grinin for a meeting. It was held on February the 22nd at the President's office. This is the first time we're publishing a memo drafted afterward. I expressed my surprise with the ambassador's statement made on Saturday, February the 20th of this year, that he had not received any letter from the office of the President of the Republic of Poland. In particular, since we had raised the issue in our conversations in February this year, I stressed that the discussion provoked by the statement was unnecessary and interfered with the positive atmosphere that should accompany the commemoration. Tomasz Arabski, head of the Prime Minister Tusk's office, flies to Moscow on March the 17th, 2010. Among other things, he plans to meet Yuri Ushakov. A meeting of the two, working closely with the Prime Ministers of Poland and Russia, respectively, took place at a bizarre location, the Dorian Gray restaurant in Moscow. This is not the first time those in attendance have met in such informal circumstances. Less than a month earlier, they had seen each other in Warsaw, where they continued, which started at the Prime Minister's office at a Warsaw restaurant, according to the Polish prosecutor's office. Apparently, the informal nature of the meeting in Warsaw appealed to them so much that they decided to repeat the same in Moscow. What's more, according to testimony that was given in the investigation, at one point, Tomasz Arabski asked Justyna Gladish, who interpreted at least part of the meeting, to leave. As for the circumstances of these conversations, Tomasz Arabski was not particularly effusive either before the court or when he answered questions from journalists after he left the courtroom. Donald Tusk also spoke vaguely before the court about Arabski's meeting with Ushakov. From my point of view, it was important for Minister Arabski to establish the subject of the talks in Smolensk with his counterparts, i.e. the relevant people in this context. The problem was, and this is what I expect from Minister Arabski, that the Russians should be aware that on the occasion, on the day we honour the victims of Katyn, we were not going to discuss some detailed Russian or Polish proposals pertaining to the economy, energy, etc. Even though it is clear that both sides have some agenda of their own on these matters, and some views and issues to clarify. Although some scant information about the meeting has been revealed on many occasions over the years, its actual course remains unclear. Tomasz Arabski and Yuri Ushakov sent back the officials accompanying them. They had a one-on-one conversation, at least for a part of that meeting. Documents available in the archives of the Prime Minister's Chancellery include just a single sentence as to the content of the conversation between Ushakov and Arabsky. The official document discusses the second part of the meeting, which took place at the same place, at the same time, much more extensively. It was a meeting between Tomasz Arabsky and Igor Sechin, Russia's Deputy Prime Minister in charge of gas and energy issues. You know it just as well as we do. I've discussed the Prime Minister's visit to Russia, like I have said many times before. Here is the content of that memo, never published before. Igor Sechin said that the improvement and normalization of political relations between Poland and the Russian Federation should come together with improvement in the economic relations. He proposed a declaration or perhaps an agreement on economic cooperation, particularly in the field of energy, to be signed in Smolensk in the presence of the prime ministers of both countries. I expressed my surprise and doubts as to whether the signing of such documents could take place on this date in the context of the Katyn commemoration. Second, stated that the Russian Federation proposed cooperation based on the principle of mutual benefits in the following areas. 1. Nuclear energy. A. Partnership in the Kroleviec power plant project. 2. Oil. A. Long-term oil supply agreement for Orlen. B. Investment cooperation in Mazeikiai and resolution of oil supply problems for the refinery. 3. Gas. A. Prompt signing of a contract for the supply of coal to Poland. B. Possible cooperation on coal gasification technology. In the document summary, Tomasz Arabsky writes that Poland does not want to sign a gas agreement on April the 7th in Smolensk. At the same time, he adds that it's not in the intention of Poland to delay such an agreement. It seems to me that an analysis would be essential, and I think one is going to be carried out, even if it hasn't so far. Someone's going to perform one in the future. Analysis of all that preceded the two visits. That is, this completely gross interference by Ambassador Grinin, the astounding support for Ambassador's attack on Polish president that came from the Polish side.
W ataku ambasadora na naszego polskiego prezydenta.
All the intricacies involving the then head of Prime Minister Donald Tusk's office in terms of his contacts with Russia and coming to an agreement on the shape of the visit, the separation of the visits, then the shape of the Prime Minister Tusk's visit, and all the things that he later skimmed over during the hearings, that he was not dealing with the President Lech Kaczynski's visit, as it was semi-private visit. I think this is something that is the most difficult to explain, but there it is. A process is going on there, pointing to those directly involved in the Russian operation that resulted in murdering Polish citizens in Smolensk. I think this is the moment that really, this tiny thing that you have to screen really carefully, and then everything will come to light. Tomasz Arabsky wasn't meeting just anyone within the Russian security system. He was meeting key actors appearing over and over in the course of all the most important and darkest affairs of the Vladimir Putin Russian Federation. So what did they talk about? We can't even ask the interpreter, because the interpreter had to step out of the meeting. So that's why I'm saying that this period of preparations for the visit, there are these strong signals indicating who played what instrument in drafting this fake score. It's terrifying. When I first realized, seeing the accounts of these events and looked at Tomasz Arabsky's resume, and looking at the resumes of his Moscow counterparts who talked with him at that restaurant, when I read into what these Russian guys were doing, what they were like, I remember that this disparity was so stunning. Well, actually, what could Tomasz Arabsky have achieved even in that meeting there? Actually, I think the Russians carried out their plan, brought it to successful fruition, as you can see, and they needed the Polish guy there just to get the specific points of this Russian scenario carried out more or less decently. They probably didn't expect anything particularly good, but at least reasonably decent.
7 kwietnia 2010
On April the 7th, 2010, Donald Tusk and Vladimir Putin arrived at Smolensk-Severentsy airport. The event starts at the Russian part of the cemetery with the laying of the cornerstone for a new Orthodox church in the area of the necropolis.
części nekropolii. W tej części uroczystości przemawia
Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin is the only speaker during that part. The Polish Prime Minister is in the background. He doesn't take the floor. He is used merely to lay the cornerstone together with the Russian Prime Minister, to send a symbolic message that Poland accepts the Russian point of view on Katyn.
że strona polska akceptuje rosyjski punkt widzenia w sprawie Katynia.
Let me say that after the cornerstone is laid, then after the construction is completed, after this church is erected, this spot, undoubtedly associated with tragedy and crime before, will turn into a sacred place.
Zamienia się w miejsce święte. Będzie to miejsce, gdzie i zwykli obywatele, i krewni.
One where both ordinary citizens and relatives of those who died here, Poles, Russians and representatives of other nations of the Soviet Union who rest in the Katyn soil, will be able to come to lay flowers and pray.
Będzie to miejsce, gdzie ci ludzie będą mogli przyjść, żeby złożyć kwiaty i się pomodlić.
Zanim rozpoczął się
Before the next part of the event began, the Polish Prime Minister had to swallow another bitter pill served by Vladimir Putin. Prime Minister Tusk was not allowed to get into the car he was to use for transport because it was Vladimir Putin's car, and Vladimir Putin was not in a hurry to get into the car himself. The Polish Prime Minister and his entourage waited for the Russian Prime Minister and could get into the car only after Vladimir Putin graciously took off his jacket.
do samochodu mógł dopiero kiedy Władimir Putin łaskawie zdjął marynarkę. W kolejnej części
In
uroczystości
the next part of the
premierzy
event,
dochodzą
the Prime
do
Ministers
polskiej
reach
części
the
cmentarza.
Polish part of the cemetery.
Tam wygłaszają
There,
przemówienie.
they make their speeches. Vladimir Putin is the first one to speak here, too.
W ziemi tej spoczywają
Buried here
obywatele
are
radzieccy,
Soviet
którzy
citizens who
zginęli w
burned in
ogniu
the fire of
represji
Stalinist
stalinowskich w latach
repressions in the 1930s.
30.
Polish officers executed under a secret order, and Red Army soldiers executed by the Nazis during the Great Patriotic War. Russia and Poland, like no other countries, Russians and Poles, like no other nations of Europe, got to suffer from nearly all the tragedies of the 20th century, paying a high price, too high a price for the two world wars.
Praktycznie wszystkie tragedie XX wieku. Zapłacić olbrzymią, zbyt wysoką cenę za 2 wojny światowe. Za bratobójcze zbrojne konflikty.
For fratricidal armed conflicts, for the cruelty and inhumanity of totalitarianism. During decades of cynical lies, they've been trying to conceal the truth about the Katyn executions. But it was just as much of a lie to place the blame for these on the Russian people. We need to come closer together and realize that it's impossible to live with that past only.
sobie i zdawać sobie sprawę, że nie sposób żyć wyłącznie tą przeszłością.
Putin przedstawia w swoim
In
przemówieniu
his speech, Putin portrays Katyn as a crime whose victims belong to two nations, Polish and Russian. Then he talks about other places, other crimes, other victims of the totalitarian regime. Only afterwards is the Polish Prime Minister able to take the floor.
przemawia polski premier.
Pamiętamy o
We remember the crime committed against people. We also remember the crime that was committed or attempted against the entire nation. But as Poles, we also want to remember other nations, not only here in Katyn. Whenever Polish leaders came here, already in the days of Free Poland, they also remembered the Russians who were buried here, and others, members of other nations.
także o Rosjanach, którzy leżą w tej ziemi i innych, pochodzących z innych narodów. Tu w Katyniu także trzeba dziś
Here in Katyn, it is also necessary to say it today, to find that courage and strength finally, and say that there is a path to reconciliation ahead, that we are not shutting anything down. We must find that courage and strength to finally open everything up. We want to remember precisely in order to make this path to reconciliation as simple and short as possible.
Właśnie po to, aby ta droga do pojednania była jak najprostsza i jak najkrótsza.
Polski premier powstrzymuje się od tego, żeby
The Polish Prime Minister refrains from indicating the uniqueness of this crime. He lists it together with the very same things Putin mentioned and staged in Katyn. Because Putin staged the opening of the Russian memorial, including an Orthodox chapel, and the Polish Prime Minister, together with the Russian Prime Minister, visit this new Russian memorial, giving these crimes committed against Soviet citizens a first-class dimension, so to speak, and only afterwards they proceed to visit the Polish memorial.
obywatelach sowieckich pierwszorzędny, że tak powiem, wymiar, a dopiero później oni idą do tego polskiego memoriału. Najlepszym podsumowaniem...
The best summary of April the 7th, 2010 commemoration attended by Prime Minister Tusk and Prime Minister Putin is one of several opinions I read in one of the reports by the Polish intelligence on the events of April the 7th.
Jednym z raportów polskich służb specjalnych na temat wydarzeń z 7 kwietnia, w której to opinii
There,
przeczytałem,
I
że
read that Poland actually played in the orchestra conducted by Vladimir Putin.
w orkiestrze dyrygowanej przez Władimira Putina.
The entirety of these events, their nature and course, was structured quite precisely by the Kremlin and imposed onto Poland.
Przebieg została dość precyzyjnie przygotowana na Kremlu i narzucona polskiej stronie. Chodzi generalnie o to, że w cudzysłowie
The general point was that for the Polish Katyn to become a part of the Great Katyn, whose main victims were, as Vladimir Putin himself said on April the 7th, 2010, Soviet citizens.
2010 roku obywatele radzieccy.
And I must admit here, however sad but true it may be, that I share this perception of the Polish intelligence.
Jest smutna, ale jest prawdziwa i ja tą refleksję polskich służb specjalnych podzielam.
The Polish Prime Minister had two options for his participation in the commemoration. One was to host a commemoration organized by the Polish institutions together with President Lech Kaczynski to honor the Polish officers murdered in Katyn. The other was to be a guest at an event hosted by the Russian Federation. He chose the latter. That is, for collaboration on this issue, he preferred Vladimir Putin to President Lech Kaczynski.
Wolał współpracować w tej sprawie z Władimirem Putinem niż z prezydentem Lechem Kaczyńskim.
On April the 9th, 2 days after the Russian government organized a commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the Katyn massacre finished in Russia, another resolution on the matter was passed here in the Polish Sejm. It reads that the Sejm of the Republic of Poland pays tribute to the memory of Polish prisoners of war, victims of the genocidal Soviet regime. In this resolution, once again, the Katyn massacre is not referred to as a genocide. It's just the regime that is called genocidal. The resolution does not contain any reference to the demand to identify all the perpetrators of this crime, and there is no reference to any compensation for the crimes either. Instead, there is room for a concept where Katyn massacre and its Polish victims are just one of many groups, along with Russians, victims of Stalinist communism.
Rosjan, ofiar stalinowskiego komunizmu.
Honouring the memory of our compatriots, the Parliament of the Republic of Poland also pays tribute to all victims of Stalinist communism. We are aware that the Katyn forest is also a place of rest for the remains of thousands of Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians and members of other nations. The painful experiences of the 20th century totalitarianisms should unite our nations rather than divide them. The resolution also makes direct reference to Donald Tusk and Vladimir Putin and the latter's alleged determination to uncover all the circumstances of the crimes, disclose the investigative documents and rehabilitate the Katyn massacre victims. The joint participation by Donald Tusk, Prime Minister of the Republic of Poland, and Vladimir Putin, Prime Minister of the Russian Federation, in the commemoration in Katyn is an important and symbolic gesture. We believe that the attendance by the Prime Minister of the Russian Federation at the commemoration in Katyn is a harbinger of the Russian side's determination to resolve these issues on a positive note.
Tego samego dnia,
On the same day that Sejm passed its resolution on Katyn, a few hundred kilometers from Warsaw, Dmitry Medvedev, president of the Russian Federation, was launching the construction of the Nord Stream 1 gas pipeline. The next day, President Lech Kaczynski and his delegation were leaving on their last journey to Smolensk.
Wyruszał w swoją ostatnią podróż do Smoleńska.
Kiedy jesteś blisko wszystkich naszych myśli, staje się realne to, co nam się przyśni, i wszystkie słowa wypowiedziane, bo jesteś naszym wrogiem albo naszym kompanem.